Well, hey, everybody, and welcome to the Daily Bible Podcast presented by Saint Church. My name is Caleb, and our hope is to help you study the Word of God every single day. Every day, we are taking time to upload episodes onto YouTube, Spotify, and Apple, where we are reading a chapter of the Bible, looking at the context it was written in, and seeing what it has to say for us today. And so today, I'm glad that you're here with us on the podcast as we are going to be diving in to Esther Chapter 5. Now, really quick before we dive in, I just wanted to make sure to mention this last couple of episodes. If you are on YouTube and if you don't mind subscribing to the channel, leaving a like on the video, one, it's going to help you not to miss any of the episodes coming out, but also it's going to help people to know this is content they can trust and that they should lean into. And if you guys are on Spotify and Apple, if you don't mind just taking a moment at the end of the episode to leave a 5-star rating, it just helps people again to know they can trust this content and that it's worth checking out. But you guys right now, my hope is that we can study the word together. So let's dive on in. Esther chapter 5. Let's see where the story takes us today as we read the word of God. Esther 5, verse 1, it says this. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given to you." "If it pleases the king," replied Esther, "let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I have prepared for him." "Bring Haman at once," the king said, "so that we may do what Esther asks." So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. As they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, "Now what is your petition?" "It will be given to you." "And what is your request?" "Even up to half the kingdom it will be granted." Esther replied, "My petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question." Haman went out that day, happy and in high spirits. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. Calling together his friends and Zeresh, his wife, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honored him, and how he had elevated him above the other nobles and officials. "And that's not all," Haman added. "I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave, and she has invited me along with the king tomorrow. But all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate." His wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Have a pole set up, reaching to a height of 50 cubits, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself." This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the pole set up. And that's the close of Esther chapter 5. You see, in this chapter, we're going to be looking at the juxtaposition, the comparison of Esther and Haman. But first, really quick, let me make sure we remember where we're at in the story. In Esther chapter 1, we end up seeing that King Xerxes, he's in search of a new queen because of sending Queen Vashti away. And so in chapter 2, we end up seeing that Esther has the opportunity to be brought into the king's household, and she ends up being selected to be queen to King Xerxes. Now, in the process of all of this, we end up seeing this guy Haman, who we see mentioned here, brought onto the scene. Now, Haman, he's not a good guy. He's a pretty evil guy. He's a vile person who hates people that get in his way, and he is prideful. You see, one day when he was out and he was going throughout his business, he expected everyone to bow to him, to subject themselves to them, except we end up seeing that Mordecai, a Jewish man, Esther's uncle, was unwilling to do this. And so in this moment, we end up seeing that he is so inflamed with rage and hate towards Mordecai that he goes to King Xerxes and he says, hey, let's get rid of all the Jewish people, make an edict, make an irrevocable law that all the Jewish people are fair game to be killed throughout the entire kingdom on a certain day. And because King Xerxes is brash in his own decision making, he lets Haman do this. Now, Esther, she's a Jewish woman. She is the niece of Mordecai. And so Esther, she's hidden her identity this entire time based off the advisement of Mordecai. And so Mordecai, he ends up going and he ends up appealing to her that she would go before the king to make a request on the behalf of her people. Now, this is a big deal because if she goes before the king and he does not extend his scepter like we saw done at the start of this chapter, then she would be put to death. And so Esther, what she does is she finally looks and says, okay, I'll do it, but pray and fast with me for 3 days, and then I'll go before the king. And that's where we see this chapter start. You might say, Caleb, that started off so just she goes in front of the king extends her scepter, and then he listens to her. Well, that was a life or death moment, that if he did not receive her in that moment, she would have been put to death on the spot for going into the king's presence unannounced and uninvited. And so at the very start of this, what do we see? We see God's prayers answered. We see the prayers of God's people answered as God hears them and sees them. And so in this moment, Esther goes before the king, and man, she's wise because he says, what do you want? And what she could have done in that moment, she could have looked and she could have said, well, king, I'm a Jewish woman actually, and look at what Haman has done. We have to do something about this. No. What does she do? She is wise. She makes sure that the request is made at the right time. And so she goes and she says, king, you know what? Let's do this banquet. She does one banquet. She brings in Haman. She's having all of this moment and opportunity to be able to build up the relationship once again. Why? She hasn't been in his presence for a month is what we end up reading about in the previous chapter. And so what is she able to do? She is building back up relationships. She's being wise, invites them back, another banquet that we'll get to read about later on. But Haman, oh my goodness, Haman, he leaves, and you end up having Esther, who she's walking in humility. She's walking subjecting herself to God and being honorable to God and to God's people. We see that she's having wisdom in her decisions. She is being slow to speak. She's listening to wise counsel. Yet what do we see of Haman? We see that Haman goes and he has this great day where he's just thinking so much of himself. He's not grateful at all. He's prideful in it all. And we end up seeing that Haman goes back to his house and he ends up saying all this cool stuff happened, but I hate it. Why? Because this guy Mordecai, he won't submit to me. He won't choose to honor me. He won't give me the respect that I think I deserve and that sort of a thing. And so he ends up having foolish advice that he's quick to listen to. He makes a brash decision, and he's set tomorrow to kill Mordecai. He's like, I'm done with this guy. So he sets up a poll so that he would be able to see Mordecai executed. And he's going to go back to the king to make this request. Now, again, in this chapter, what are we seeing? Well, one, we're seeing the story develop. We're seeing the wisdom of Esther put on display, and we are seeing the foolishness of Haman continue to be fleshed out and revealed to us. Now, tomorrow, we're going to get to dive in to how this story just really gets to have the flames stoked, and we're going to see the intensity go up. But really fast, how about for us today? How do we end up reading this and think of anything for ourselves? Well, here's what I would like to say. One, Esther, at the very beginning of this, she asked people to pray and fast for, and sometimes we end up going to God and we ask him for prayers. We ask him to do things in our prayers. And we end up seeing that God answers those prayers, but it's so subtle, it's so quick that we don't end up acknowledging the fact that God answered that prayer. You see, for Esther, she spent 3 days fasting and praying just so that the king would extend his scepter when she walked into the room. For you and I, when we read that, we just say, oh yeah, she walked in the room. The king said, yeah, glad you're here. For her, that was a life or death moment when God answered a prayer. I want you to hear this today. Do not take for granted the moments when God has answered prayers in your life. Don't take it for granted. Don't look around and think to yourself, man, that just happened. No, God is being faithful to his word. And then we see that she walks in wisdom. We got to be wise. We got to be slow to speak. We got to be quick to listen. We got to be willing to honor God and his timing and how we should go about things. And we also need to look at Haman, and we got to realize, do not be prideful. Do not be arrogant. Stop looking around and letting people dictate how you're going to feel. Allow God to position you for where you need to be at and honor him in the midst of it all. Now, with that being said, you guys, that's it for today. That's it for this chapter of Esther. And I want to say thank you for jumping on. Thanks for taking time to study the Word of God. That's what this podcast is all about, helping people to read the Word and study the Word every single day. So once again, if you guys enjoyed this and you have any questions at all, please make sure to comment them. We want clarity, not confusion. If you enjoyed the podcast, leave a like on the video. You could check out some of our past studies that we've done as well on all of our channels. If you guys liked it and you're on YouTube, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you're on Apple or Spotify, if you don't mind following, subscribing, and leaving a rating and a review. 5 stars helps people know they can trust the content. But with that being said, you guys, thanks for jumping on today. I can't wait to see you tomorrow because we are taking time to study the Word of God every single day.